I think this country is a vast improvement on what we found in 2001.
That's David Cameron's assessment of the Afghanistan catastrophe. But apart from all the lives lost, what's been the financial cost of our recent wars? Britain has spent an estimated £30 billion on 2 failed wars since 2003, and that doesn't include sundries. And judging by the noises the government still makes when it comes to foreign interventions, the taxpayer could be footing the bills for years to come. Of course, this is all good business for arms manufacturers. But with the war on terror an epic failure, what is the true financial cost to Britain? With me is John Rees from the Stop the War Coalition and the author of Imperialism and Resistance. Welcome back, John. How did you arrive at this £1,000 a person figure for the Afghan and Iraq wars?
Well, we're not expert mathematicians at the Stop the War Coalition, so we did a very simple calculation. We took the most recent estimates from one of the most authoritative statistical agencies and divided it per head of the population. This is the per capita figure, and it's quite an astounding one, and larger than the estimates in the past.
And do you think the politicians, there's a reason why they don't try and tell us about that? Because we've got to say, though, that Britain does spend less than America, percentage-wise, on military.
Most people do. But of the European countries, the UK defence budget historically and still is one of the larger, and the UK defence industry is a disproportionate amount of UK industry compared to some other European powers as well. So we should be clear that this is a very big part of British society, but it's a very hidden part of British society, and it's not surprising in a time of austerity that politicians are not coming on television and saying, look, I'm terribly sorry about the hospital and your job's going, but don't worry, BAE Systems is doing very well, thank you.
But is that actually a good equation to produce, as it were? Because it is good for the economy, isn't it? War.
No, it's disproportionately bad for the economy. If you spend this kind of money in any other industry, if you spend this money, for instance, producing a new car factory, or if you build a new supermarket, it puts more back into the economy than defence spending does, for a very simple reason. What comes off the end of a line in a defence industry plays no further part in the economy. If you're lucky, what it does, it stands in a field, rots, until you replace it. If you're unlucky, it gets blown up on a battlefield somewhere. But it doesn't reproduce itself in terms of capital spending, in terms of employment, in terms of the knock-on effect in wages in the economy. So no, it's a very bad way to spend money if the idea is that you want to boost an economy. You'd be better off doing what J.M. Keynes suggested in the slump, paying people to dig holes in the road and fill them in.
Okay, but it is, well, that is a question, actually, because okay, it's an inefficient method of Keynesian reflation, but every pound, £1,000 a person, it does add to the GDP. I know this sounds like an odd conversation because we're forgetting all the millions bereaved, but...
Yeah, and that's an important point, because it would also boost the economy if you gave every householder a machete and set them loose on their neighbours. Undertakers would have a far better economy. That money would go into people's pocket, but, you know, you have to judge it on something more than this. Even if you judge it just narrowly economically, it's a bad way of spending money. Judged by any other moral criteria, it's a disaster.
And obviously that machete point, I mean, obviously in the realm of the ridiculous, but then in the corridors of power, presumably there are calculations being made when more money, subsidy is being given to Britain's largest manufacturer, BAE Systems, or weapons manufacturers, or prosthetic limbs manufacturers, or whatever, after these wars. Yeah,
but the calculations are wholly different. You know, the defence industry operates without scrutiny that it's normal in other areas of work. I mean, you can see what the ballooning estimates for projects inside the defence industry are. That wouldn't be tolerated in any other area of economic activity.
And of course, I mean, there are these other calculations. 5,000 nurses or police for their entire career could have been paid, free university tuition for everyone for a decade. Do you think then that the people in Westminster and in the Labour Party and the Conservatives who voted for the war, those wars, believe, well, it was our national security, though, so that's why those nurses or police or...
Yeah, it's a kind of ring-fenced area of spending, and it's a ring-fenced area of national debate. You aren't allowed to tread on this territory, and no establishment politician does. I mean, the vast majority of people outside, by all the opinion polls and every response you get whenever you mention this kind of thing in any kind of public forum, the public think very, very differently to this. It's part of the democratic deficit in this country that one of the most contentious, the most important, the most dangerous things in the society can't be talked about.
Okay, if you believe that these wars are inefficient, again we're forgetting all the dead, do they at least create volatility in the Middle East from which British firms can benefit from, and speculation in the City of London, one of Britain's greatest exporters? At least there's some input into our economy by creating constant volatility overseas?
Oh yeah, I think the arms manufacturers and their spin masters love a crisis. They will arm both sides. You know, believe me, BAE Systems will arm the Saudi regime to a huge extent. It's now in a quarrel with the Qataris. It'll arm them as well. That's what arms industries do. It's why it's such an immoral industry. And we all remember the minute that the demonstrations died down for a second in Tahrir Square. David Cameron was out there standing in that square, and the guy behind him was from BAE Systems, because they thought, hey, this is a new government, we can sell them weapons, and sell them weapons, by the way, on that deal that was being used to shoot down the protesters.
Okay, but at least the Cameron government is committed to withdrawal from Afghanistan, but now we're hearing more expenditure again on drones. Is there spending creep yet again that we have to be aware of?
Yeah, and now with the crisis in Ukraine and the pressure from the Americans for burden sharing, as they call it, for the Europeans to pay more, the head of NATO made a speech saying all the European countries now have to step up to the plate, have to increase their arms expenditure. This is the kind of arms expenditure increases which make the drone program look like pocket money.
And of course the biggest arms expenditure, I mean, your £1,000 a person figure for Afghanistan and Iraq, there's Trident and the nuclear missile system there. Is that good for our economy from the economics viewpoint?
No, well, Trident is actually the perfect example of the kind of waste arms expenditure that I was describing earlier. This is
lots of jobs, though, lots of manufacturing.
Well, typically not, because they're very, very high-tech, specialised things, so they don't create masses of jobs. If you spent the same kind of money building supermarkets, there would be a multiple of the existing jobs in here. And of course, I'm in favour of those people who do that work now being given other comparable work to do. But like I say, you're building something which is going to go and sail around the sea or sit in Faz Lane, and as we now find, after a generation, you have to replace it at a cost of £75 billion. You would wipe out 3/4 of the entire deficit that this government is so obsessed with by cancelling that programme.
And arguably one of the big shadows on all these taxpayers, apart from the wars themselves, Britain's power in the world after fighting these wars and spending for all these wars. What are the dangers as we see the decline of the United States, and what the BRICS economies must think of Britain because it took part in the wars?
Well, we are at a critical moment, I think, and the vote last year on whether or not to support the American intended raid on Syria was a watershed moment. No British Prime Minister has gone to the House of Commons and asked for a vote for war and not got it since 1782. Cameron was the first person since that time to not get a vote for war. And that, as we saw, had a massive knock-on effect. It actually forced Obama to say, OK, we've got to go to Congress.
And then all of these tens of billions of pounds has also increased, arguably, the threats to British national security.
Yes, and I mean, particularly actually at the moment, the drones programme that you mentioned, you know, in his speech to the West Point Academy, Obama said, we must ensure that when we use this policy, we don't create more enemies than we kill on the battlefield. Now, by his own criteria, the drones programme is doing exactly the opposite. Every wedding party hit, and we know this from reports on the ground in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, in Somalia. This is happening. So this is the definition of a counterproductive activity.
And then national security here in Britain.
Of course, because, you know, people see this, especially in those communities most closely tied to the communities where this is happening, react in a completely understandable way, as you or I would react if the wedding, you know, reception of our family had been hit by a drone. They react very, very strongly to that, of course.
But in terms of British business then, British business abroad, because we are talking about, you know, the costs of these wars, what effect it has?
Sell something else. You know, every other European economy is less dependent on arms, and you could argue much more strongly based in its manufacturing industry because it sells something else. It sells cars, or it sells cement, or it sells buses, or it sells trains. You know, these are things, by the way, which often aren't even built in Britain any longer, where we have to go and buy them. It would be better, and the economy would be stronger, and we would be richer if you built something else.
John Rees, thank you.
Thank you.